The small town of Riverton was like many others, a place where everyone knew each other's name. Secrets were whispered behind closed doors, and change came at a snail's pace. It was the kind of town where the local diner's neon sign flickered year-round, and where the sheriff's car was as much a fixture as the church steeple on Main Street. But beneath its calm surface, Riverton held tensions that were as old as the streets themselves, tensions that would soon ignite in a way no one saw coming. It all began on a late summer afternoon. The sky was heavy with grey clouds, the kind that promised rain but hadn't quite delivered. On the outskirts of town, a narrow, dusty road led to a run-down gas station. That's where Officer Mitchell, a tall, broad-shouldered cop with an intimidating presence, pulled up in his patrol car. Mitchell wasn't just any officer. He was a man of routine, someone who believed in order and control. But his version of control had often made him the subject of quiet conversations about how his actions sometimes seemed to target certain people more than others. On this particular day, Mitchell spotted a young woman standing near the gas station's convenience store. Her name was Amina, and she had lived in Riverton for just a few years. Amina was striking, not just in her appearance, but in the quiet confidence she carried. Dressed in a bright yellow dress that seemed to defy the gloomy sky, she stood out. She was filling a gas can, her old sedan parked just a few feet away, but Mitchell's eyes lingered longer than they should have. As he stepped out of his cruiser, the air seemed to thicken. The chatter of the gas station's old radio faded into the background, and the few customers around turned their heads. Mitchell walked over with slow, deliberate steps. Amina glanced up, her brow furrowing slightly, but she said nothing. "Ma'am, can I ask what you're doing here?" Mitchell's tone was firm, almost accusatory. Amina straightened her back. "I'm filling up my gas can. My car broke down a mile back," she said, her voice calm but with an edge of confusion. "That your car?" Mitchell gestured toward the sedan. "Yes," she replied, keeping her tone steady. "Funny. Doesn't look like it belongs around here," he said, narrowing his eyes. Amina blinked, her jaw tightening. "It's mine," she repeated, more firmly this time. Mitchell's gaze swept over her, his expression unreadable. To anyone watching, it was clear he wasn't just questioning her. He was sizing her up, challenging her presence. The tension in the air grew thick enough to cut. A few people started to inch closer, their curiosity overpowering their desire to stay out of it. Among them was Mr. Harris, the elderly gas station owner, who had seen enough in his years to recognize trouble brewing. He watched silently, his hand resting on the counter inside the store. Mitchell stepped closer to Amina, his hand brushing the radio on his shoulder as though he was ready to call for backup. "You got ID on you?" he asked. Amina hesitated. "Is there a reason you're asking me that?" "Just doing my job," Mitchell replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. At that moment, the clouds above finally gave way, and a light rain began to fall. It wasn't enough to drive anyone away, but it added to the growing unease. Amina slowly reached into her bag and handed over her ID. Mitchell took it, examining it as though it held some great secret. "Stay right there," he said, walking back toward his patrol car. As Mitchell radioed in her information, Amina stood by her car, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She could feel the eyes of the onlookers, their silent judgment, their curiosity. She didn't know whether to feel anger, fear, or exhaustion. Maybe it was all three. When Mitchell returned, his expression was harder to read. "Everything checks out," he said, almost reluctantly. But instead of handing back her ID, he held onto it. "Mind telling me why you're out here alone?" Amina's eyes widened slightly, disbelief flashing across her face. "I told you, my car broke down. I walked here to get gas." "That's quite a walk," Mitchell said, his tone laced with skepticism. Before Amina could respond, another car pulled into the gas station. It was sleek, black, and unfamiliar. Definitely not the type of car you'd expect to see in Riverton. The driver, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit, stepped out, immediately drawing attention. He looked around, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. "Is there a problem here?" the man asked, his voice calm but firm. Mitchell straightened up, his demeanor shifting slightly. "And who might you be?" The man walked closer, his gaze steady. "Someone who doesn't appreciate seeing this young lady being harassed." A ripple of surprise ran through the small crowd. Mitchell's jaw tightened, and for a moment he seemed at a loss for words. Amina glanced at the man, her expression unreadable, but her posture relaxing just a fraction. "You don't know what you're talking about," Mitchell said, his voice colder now. "Don't I?" the man replied, his tone as sharp as his suit. The rain picked up, the sound of droplets on the pavement filling the silence. The onlookers held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Amina finally spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. "Can I have my ID back now?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. Mitchell hesitated, his grip on the card tightening for just a moment before he finally handed it back. "You're free to go," he said, his voice clipped. Amina didn't waste any time. She took her ID, walked to her car, and began pouring the gas into the tank. The suited man stayed where he was, watching Mitchell with an intensity that seemed to unnerve the officer. As Amina drove off, the tension lingered in the air. But what no one realized was that this encounter was just the beginning. The events that would follow would not only shake the town of Riverton to its core, but also force everyone involved to confront truths they'd long tried to ignore. For Officer Mitchell, Amina, and the mysterious stranger, the story was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. Underscore 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 underscore. Would you like me to continue with the next part of the story? The rain had settled into a steady drizzle as Amina drove down the narrow road, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. Her heart was still racing, though she tried to focus on the rhythm of the wipers as they cleared the windshield. She had always known that being in a town like Riverton came with unspoken challenges, but today felt different. It felt personal. She replayed the interaction in her mind, wondering if she could have said something differently, done something to de-escalate the situation. But deep down, she knew none of it would have mattered. Officer Mitchell, with his cold eyes and condescending tone, had already made up his mind about her before she even opened her mouth. She had seen that look before, on others in Riverton who pretended to smile while keeping their distance, and on the faces of people who assumed they knew her story simply because of the color of her skin. Amina had moved to Riverton 3 years ago, chasing a quieter life after the chaos of the city had worn her down. She thought the charm of a small town would give her a fresh start, a chance to find peace and maybe even a sense of belonging. But Riverton was a place where the past clung tightly to the present, where change was met with suspicion, and where someone like her was always an outsider. Her old sedan sputtered as she pulled into the driveway of her modest home, a small white house with chipped paint and a front porch she loved to sit on during summer evenings. Tonight, though, she had no desire to linger outside. As she stepped out of the car, the rain soaking her dress, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching her. Inside, Amina locked the door and leaned against it, letting out a long breath. She set her keys on the table and peeled off her wet shoes, her mind still buzzing. Who was the man in the black car? And why had he stepped in to defend her? She didn't recognize him, and Riverton wasn't exactly a town that attracted strangers. His sharp demeanor and the way he had stood up to Mitchell had surprised her. For a brief moment, she felt a flicker of hope that not everyone in this town saw her as other. Meanwhile, back at the gas station, Mitchell was sitting in his patrol car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His face was a storm of emotions: anger, embarrassment, and something else he couldn't quite name. The confrontation with the man in the suit had left him rattled. He didn't like being challenged, especially not in front of an audience. Riverton was his town, and he prided himself on keeping it in order. But there was something about that man that made Mitchell uneasy. He wasn't just another passerby or concerned citizen. There was an authority in his voice, a confidence that Mitchell couldn't ignore. He hadn't even gotten the man's name, and that fact nagged at him as he stared out at the rain-soaked streets. Mitchell decided to take a drive, hoping the familiar roads would clear his head. As he cruised through the quiet neighborhoods, his mind wandered back to Amina. He didn't know much about her, but he had noticed her presence in town. She was quiet, kept to herself, but there was something about her that seemed to unsettle him. Maybe it was her confidence, the way she didn't shrink under his scrutiny like others did. He shook his head, frustrated with himself. He told himself he was just doing his job, that his instincts were what kept the town safe. But a small voice in the back of his mind whispered otherwise, a voice he quickly silenced. Back at home, Amina was curled up on her couch, a blanket draped over her shoulders. She stared at the flickering light of the television, though she wasn't paying attention to what was on. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Mitchell and the stranger. She wondered if the encounter was just another unfortunate moment she'd have to add to her collection of experiences in Riverton, or if it was the start of something bigger. The next morning, Riverton was buzzing with gossip. At the diner, over cups of coffee and plates of bacon and eggs, the locals whispered about what had happened at the gas station. The details were already distorted, the story growing with each retelling. Some painted Amina as a troublemaker, while others defended her, saying she had done nothing wrong. And then there was the mysterious man, who had become the center of speculation. Who do you think he was? Mrs. Carmichael, the diner's owner, asked as she poured coffee for a customer. Probably some lawyer or something, her customer replied. Did you see the car he was driving? Definitely not from around here. Maybe he's with the state, another patron chimed in. Could be some investigator. You know they've been cracking down on small-town cops lately. The theories swirled, but no one had any real answers. Riverton was a town where everyone prided themselves on knowing everyone else's business, and the idea that someone had slipped through the cracks was both thrilling and unsettling. Amina avoided the diner that morning, as she often did when she knew she'd be the subject of conversation. Instead, she went to the small library where she worked part-time. It was her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in the quiet hum of books and the occasional friendly face. But even there, she couldn't escape the weight of the previous day. Mrs. Green, the elderly librarian who had taken Amina under her wing, gave her a concerned look as she entered. You doing all right, dear? Mrs. Green asked, her voice soft. Amina managed a small smile. I'm fine, she said, but the words felt hollow. Mrs. Green nodded but didn't press further. She had learned that Amina was someone who needed her space, someone who would share her thoughts when she was ready. As the day went on, Amina tried to focus on her work, but a sense of unease lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter with Mitchell was far from over. And then there was the stranger. Why had he been so quick to step in? What did he see in her that made him act? That evening, as Amina walked home, she noticed a black car parked at the end of her street. Her heart skipped a beat. It looked just like the one from the gas station. She slowed her pace, her eyes fixed on the car, but its tinted windows revealed nothing. When she finally reached her house, she turned to look again, but the car was gone. A chill ran down her spine. She couldn't tell if she was being paranoid or if someone really was watching her. In a town like Riverton, secrets had a way of coming to the surface, and Amina couldn't help but feel that whatever was happening, it was only the beginning. Underscore 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 underscore. Would you like me to continue with the next part of the story? The air in Riverton seemed heavier in the days that followed, as if the tension from that one moment at the gas station had rippled out into the town. Amina tried to go about her usual routine, but the sense of unease clung to her like a shadow. She noticed the subtle glances from her neighbors, the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she walked into a room. It wasn't new. She had felt those eyes on her before, but now they seemed sharper, more pointed. At the library, Amina found herself drawn to a corner table near the window, where she could watch the world outside without being too exposed. She noticed small things she hadn't before, the way people lingered on the sidewalk across the street, the unfamiliar cars that drove by more than once. She told herself it was nothing, that her mind was playing tricks on her. But the unease wouldn't leave. One afternoon, while shelving books in the back, Amina heard the library door creak open. She peeked through the rows of shelves and saw a man step inside, his tailored suit and polished demeanor out of place in the small, dusty library. It was him, the man from the gas station. Her heart skipped a beat as she watched him scan the room, his eyes eventually landing on her. "Miss Amina," he said, his voice calm but firm. "May I have a word?" She hesitated, unsure of what to say. Her instinct was to refuse, to turn and walk away, but something about his tone made her pause. She nodded and motioned for him to follow her to the reading area, where they could talk without being overheard. As they sat down, Amina studied him more closely. He seemed confident, almost too much so, but there was something in his eyes, something that made her feel he wasn't just here to satisfy his curiosity. "I didn't mean to startle you," he began. "My name is James Carter. I work for an organization that keeps an eye on situations like the one you experienced." "Situations?" Amina asked, her voice cautious. "Racial profiling. Abuse of authority. Corruption," he said plainly, as if he'd recited those words 100 times before. "What happened to you at the gas station wasn't right, and I want to help." Amina felt a mix of emotions, relief that someone believed her, anger at the injustice, and skepticism about his motives. "Why me?" she asked. "Why now?" James leaned forward, his expression serious. "Because this isn't just about you. Officer Mitchell has a history. There have been complaints, reports, but nothing sticks. Riverton's a small town, and people are afraid to speak out. But what happened with you? It's a pattern, and patterns can't be ignored." Amina felt the weight of his words sink in. She had always known that what she experienced wasn't isolated, but hearing it confirmed by someone else made it feel even heavier. "So, what do you want from me?" she asked. "Your story," James said simply. "I want to document what happened, make it part of a larger case. You don't have to decide now, but I think your voice could make a difference." Amina nodded, but she wasn't sure if she was agreeing or just trying to process everything. James handed her a card and stood up. "Take your time," he said. "I'll be in town for a few more days." As he left, Amina sat in silence, the card resting in her hand. She didn't know if she could trust him, but she also couldn't ignore the growing sense that something bigger was at play. Meanwhile, Officer Mitchell was growing restless. He had noticed the black car parked near the station more than once, and the presence of an outsider in Riverton didn't sit well with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that his every move was being scrutinized. At home, Mitchell spent his evenings poring over old reports, trying to find anything that might connect James to someone in town. But no matter how much he searched, he came up empty. It was as if James had appeared out of thin air, disrupting the fragile balance of Riverton's quiet existence. One night, as Mitchell sat in his living room, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Be careful who you trust." His stomach tightened as he stared at the screen. He didn't know who had sent it, but the warning was clear. Across town, Amina sat on her porch, the night air cool against her skin. She held James's card in her hand, turning it over and over as she weighed her options. She thought about the people in Riverton who had treated her with kindness, and those who had made her feel unwelcome. She thought about the stories she had heard from other townspeople, whispers of encounters with Mitchell that sounded all too familiar. As the night wore on, Amina made a decision. She didn't know if speaking out would change anything, but she couldn't stay silent any longer. The next morning, she dialed the number on the card. "James," she said when he answered, "I'm in." What Amina didn't know was that her decision would set off a chain of events that would shake Riverton to its core. As she hung up the phone, a car drove slowly past her house, its headlights briefly illuminating the front porch. Amina didn't notice, but someone inside the car was watching her, their eyes fixed on her silhouette. The storm that had been brewing in Riverton was about to break, and no one, least of all Amina, was prepared for what was coming next. The following days felt like a whirlwind for Amina. After her conversation with James, they agreed to meet in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of Riverton. She wasn't sure what to expect, but James came prepared, carrying a slim folder filled with documents and a small recording device. His demeanor was calm, professional, but there was an intensity in his gaze that told her he took this seriously. As Amina recounted the events at the gas station, she felt a mix of anger and vulnerability rise to the surface. Saying the words aloud made everything feel raw again, but James listened patiently, nodding at the right moments, occasionally jotting something down. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment before speaking. "You're brave for doing this," he said. "Most people wouldn't. But I need you to understand that this could get messy. Mitchell isn't the kind of person to back down, especially not when his authority is questioned." Amina nodded, her resolve firm despite the nerves bubbling inside her. "I'm tired of staying quiet," she said. "If my story can help stop him from doing this to someone else, then it's worth it." James gave her a small smile, his respect for her evident. "We're going to build a case," he said. "But it's not just about Mitchell. There's a bigger system at play here, and I think Riverton might be hiding more than we realize." The weight of his words hung in the air as Amina sipped her coffee, her mind racing. She hadn't considered the possibility that this went beyond one officer, but now she wondered how deep the problem really ran. Meanwhile, Mitchell's unease had turned into full-blown paranoia. He couldn't shake the feeling that James was digging into his past, uncovering things he had worked hard to keep buried. Late one night, he found himself in the station's archives, pulling old files and reports that he thought might come back to haunt him. He told himself it was just precautionary, but the truth was, he was afraid. For the first time, he felt like he was losing control. As Mitchell sifted through the files, he came across a report he hadn't thought about in years. It was from a case he handled shortly after joining the force, involving a young man who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The investigation had been closed quickly, labeled as a runaway, but Mitchell knew the truth was more complicated. He had been young then, eager to prove himself, and he had made choices he wasn't proud of, choices that could ruin him if they came to light. Across town, James was also digging. He had spent hours combing through public records, looking for patterns, connections, anything that might support Amina's story. What he found was troubling. Multiple complaints against Mitchell, all filed away with no follow-up. He also discovered a series of questionable incidents involving other officers in Riverton, suggesting a culture of silence and complicity within the department. When James shared his findings with Amina, she felt a surge of anger and determination. "This isn't just about me," she said. "They've been getting away with this for years." James nodded. "And that's why we can't back down now." As they worked together to piece everything together, Amina began to notice strange things happening. She'd catch glimpses of cars parked down the street from her house, their engines idling as if waiting for something. At the library, she found books misplaced on shelves she had just organized, small signs that someone had been there. She couldn't prove anything, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. One evening, as Amina was locking up the library, she noticed a figure standing across the street. Her pulse quickened as she squinted into the fading light, trying to make out who it was. The figure didn't move, didn't say anything, but she could feel their gaze on her. She hurried to her car, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the keys. When she finally managed to start the engine, she glanced back at the street, but the figure was gone. The tension in Riverton was palpable. Whispers of what was happening spread through the town, but no one dared to speak openly. Some people avoided Amina entirely, while others offered quiet words of support, their voices tinged with fear. It was clear that Riverton was holding its breath, waiting for something to give. James, too, was feeling the pressure. He had received a cryptic voicemail from an anonymous number, warning him to back off. It was the first time he felt truly uneasy about the case, but he refused to let it deter him. He doubled down on his efforts, contacting people who had filed complaints against Mitchell in the past and encouraging them to come forward. Some were hesitant, scared of retaliation, but others agreed to share their stories, emboldened by Amina's courage. As the days passed, James and Amina's case began to take shape. They had testimonies, records, and even a few old surveillance videos that painted a damning picture of Mitchell's conduct. But as they gathered evidence, the pushback grew stronger. Amina started receiving anonymous messages, some vaguely threatening, others outright intimidating. One read, "You're making a big mistake." Another simply said, "Watch your back." James tried to reassure her, but even he couldn't ignore the rising tension. One evening, as they were reviewing documents in James's rented motel room, a loud bang startled them both. They ran to the window and saw that someone had thrown a rock through the glass. Attached to it was a note that read, "Leave Riverton or else. This is getting out of hand," Amina said, her voice shaky. James nodded, his expression grim. "They're scared. That means we're getting close." But Amina wasn't so sure. The fear in her chest was growing, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. Unbeknownst to them, Mitchell was also unraveling. The pressure was mounting from all sides, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the walls closed in. He had tried to intimidate Amina and James into silence, but they weren't backing down. Desperate, he reached out to a few trusted colleagues, hoping to rally their support. But even among his allies, there was hesitation. Some of them were beginning to question if covering for Mitchell was worth the risk. One night, Mitchell sat alone in his squad car, parked on a desolate road just outside of town. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he replayed everything in his mind. He felt trapped, like a cornered animal, and his thoughts turned darker with each passing minute. He couldn't let this go any further, but he also couldn't see a way out. Back in town, Amina and James decided it was time to take their findings to someone higher up. They arranged a meeting with a journalist from a regional paper, someone James trusted to handle the story responsibly. The journalist agreed to meet them the next day at a diner just outside Riverton. As Amina drove home that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The streets were eerily quiet, and every shadow seemed to hold a threat. When she pulled into her driveway, she noticed a car parked down the block, its headlights off but its engine running. She sat in her car for a moment, debating whether to confront it or call James. Before she could decide, the car slowly drove away, disappearing into the night. The next morning, as Amina prepared to leave for the meeting, she noticed that her mailbox had been vandalized. Spray painted across the side were the words, "Stay silent." Her heart pounded as she took a picture and sent it to James. "This is escalating," James said when she showed him the photo at the diner. "We need to be extra careful." As they waited for the journalist to arrive, Amina's mind raced with questions. Was she putting herself in more danger by speaking out? Would it all be worth it in the end? She didn't know the answers, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't back down now. The sound of the diner door opening pulled her from her thoughts. The journalist walked in, a middle-aged woman with a determined expression. She introduced herself and sat down, pulling out a notepad and recorder. "All right," she said, looking between Amina and James. "Let's get started." But just as Amina began to speak, the door to the diner opened again. A hush fell over the room as Officer Mitchell walked in, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on her. The tension was unbearable as he walked toward their table, his face a mask of controlled anger. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice low but firm. "A word." Amina's hands clenched into fists under the table, her resolve tested but unbroken. "I don't think so," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. The room seemed to hold its breath as Mitchell stared at her, his jaw tightening. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving a trail of unease in his wake. The journalist looked at Amina, her eyes wide with concern. "You weren't kidding," she said. "This is serious." Amina nodded, her determination hardening. "And we're not stopping." What none of them knew was that the events set in motion that day would lead to a confrontation that would change Riverton forever. The storm was about to reach its peak, and no one would escape unscathed. The air in the diner was thick with tension after Mitchell's abrupt departure. Amina glanced out the window, half expecting to see him lurking nearby, but the street was empty except for a couple of parked cars. She forced herself to refocus as the journalist leaned in, her pen poised over her notepad. "Tell me everything," the journalist said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. Amina and James began recounting everything they'd uncovered, from Mitchell's repeated misconduct to the culture of silence that had enabled him for years. The journalist listened intently, her expression growing graver with each new detail. As Amina spoke, a wave of determination washed over her. For the first time, she felt like her voice mattered, that she was finally being heard. But outside, unseen by those in the diner, a dark sedan idled quietly at the corner, its tinted windows obscuring the occupants. The car had been following Amina and James for days, and now, as the pieces of their case began to fall into place, the stakes were higher than ever. James and Amina exchanged a glance, their resolve solidifying. They were getting closer to the truth, but they had no idea just how dangerous the next steps would be. The storm they had stirred was about to reach its peak, and neither of them was prepared for the twists that lay ahead. The sun was setting as Amina and James drove to the secluded meeting spot the former officer had shared. The location, a small, abandoned factory on the outskirts of Riverton, was eerily quiet, with only the sound of crickets breaking the silence. Amina felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach as they'd pulled up and parked. James glanced at her, his expression calm but alert. "This is it," he said. "Let's hear what they have to say and get out of here quickly." They stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath their feet echoing in the stillness. A shadow emerged from the building's doorway, and the figure of an older man came into view. His face was lined with worry, and he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear out of the darkness. "Are you James and Amina?" he asked, his voice low and trembling. They nodded, and the man gestured for them to follow him inside. Once they were in the dimly lit interior of the factory, he wasted no time. "I don't have long," he said. "I used to work with Mitchell. I saw things I regret not speaking out about sooner. But what you're uncovering now, it's bigger than him, much bigger." Amina's heart raced as the man handed over a small USB drive. "This has everything," he said. "Evidence of cover-ups, corruption, and worse. Mitchell isn't working alone. He's just a piece of the puzzle. There are others, people in positions of power, who've been pulling the strings for years." Before Amina or James could respond, the sound of tires screeching outside made them freeze. The man's eyes widened in panic. "They're here," he whispered. "You have to go, now." Without hesitation, Amina grabbed the USB drive and followed James toward the back exit. As they ran, voices and heavy footsteps echoed through the factory, closing in on them. They burst out into the cool night air, their breaths coming in quick gasps as they sprinted toward the car. Just as they reached the vehicle, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Officer Mitchell. His face was twisted with anger, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "This ends now," he said, his voice cold and unwavering. Amina felt her pulse quicken, but she refused to back down. "It's over, Mitchell," she said, holding up the USB drive. "We have the truth, and we're not stopping." Mitchell's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might draw his weapon. But then, another set of headlights appeared, illuminating the scene. It was the journalist and her crew, cameras rolling as they stepped out of their vehicle. "You're live," the journalist said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Everything you say or do is being recorded." Mitchell hesitated, his confidence faltering as the reality of the situation sank in. He glanced around, realizing he was surrounded, not just by the cameras, but by the weight of his own actions catching up to him. But just as it seemed the confrontation was over, another car pulled up. This time, it wasn't just Mitchell's accomplices. It was someone higher up in Riverton's power structure. The town's mayor stepped out, his expression cold and calculating. "You've caused quite a mess," the mayor said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You think exposing Mitchell will change anything? He's disposable. We'll replace him, and this town will go on as it always has." Amina felt a chill run down her spine. This was the twist she hadn't seen coming. The realization that Mitchell was just the tip of the iceberg. The corruption ran deeper than she could have imagined, and the people behind it were far more dangerous. But before the mayor could say anything more, the sound of sirens filled the air. James had tipped off federal investigators, and their arrival was perfectly timed. Agents poured out of unmarked cars, their badges glinting in the moonlight as they took control of the scene. Mitchell was taken into custody, his face a mixture of anger and defeat. The mayor tried to maintain his composure, but the agents weren't interested in his excuses. They had been building their own case for months, and the evidence on the USB drive was the final piece they needed to bring the entire operation down. After the meeting, James insisted on driving Amina home. She reluctantly agreed, her nerves still on edge from Mitchell's appearance. As they pulled into her driveway, James noticed something strange. A piece of paper was tucked under her windshield wiper. He stepped out of the car cautiously, scanning the street before retrieving the note. The message was chilling in its simplicity. "You're in over your head. Drop it." James showed it to Amina, his jaw tightening. "This isn't just intimidation anymore. This is a direct threat." Amina stared at the note, her mind racing. "They're scared," she said, echoing James's words from earlier. "That means we're getting close." James nodded but said nothing. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, and the ominous note only confirmed his suspicions. Later that night, as Amina tried to settle into bed, her phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. She hesitated before opening it, her heart sinking as she read the words, "You're making a big mistake. There won't be another warning." She immediately called James, her voice trembling as she explained what had happened. "This is getting out of control," she said. "We'll figure this out," James replied, though his tone betrayed his own unease. "But we need to stay careful. This is bigger than just Mitchell now." The next morning, Riverton was buzzing with rumors. Word of Amina and James' investigation had spread, and the town was divided. Some residents quietly supported them, tired of the unchecked power of the local police, while others defended Mitchell, unwilling to believe the man they'd known for years could be capable of such actions. Meanwhile, Mitchell was unraveling. He had spent the night pacing his living room, the weight of his secrets pressing down on him like never before. He knew the walls were closing in, and in his desperation, he began reaching out to people he thought he could trust. But one by one, his allies were distancing themselves, unwilling to be dragged down with him. That's when he made the decision that would change everything. Mitchell knew there was one file, one piece of evidence, that could blow the whole thing wide open. It was an old report buried deep in the station's archives, something he had hoped would never see the light of day. If Amina and James got their hands on it, his career, and possibly his freedom, would be over. Determined to take matters into his own hands, Mitchell decided to retrieve the file himself and destroy it. But he wasn't the only one interested in what those archives might hold. Unbeknownst to Mitchell, James had been digging into the station's records, using connections from his journalism days to access files that weren't meant to be public. What he found was shocking, a pattern of misconduct that went far beyond Mitchell. There were reports of cover-ups, tampered evidence, and even missing persons cases that had been quietly closed with no resolution. One name kept coming up in the files, a young man named Caleb who had disappeared nearly a decade ago. His case had been handled by Mitchell, and the more James dug, the more inconsistencies he found. It was clear that Caleb's disappearance was no accident, and Mitchell had played a key role in whatever had happened. James shared his findings with Amina, who was horrified but not surprised. "This is it," she said. "This is what they're trying to hide." But as they planned their next steps, the dark Satan reappeared. This time, it wasn't just following them. It was parked directly outside Amina's house. The message was clear. Whoever was behind, this wasn't going to let them continue without a fight. James decided it was time to bring in reinforcements. He reached out to a contact at a larger newspaper, someone with the resources and reach to take their story beyond Riverton. The journalist agreed to meet them the next day, promising to bring a camera crew to document everything. That night, Amina barely slept. Every sound outside her window made her jump, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. As the hours ticked by, she kept replaying everything in her mind. The confrontation at the gas station, the threats, the files James had uncovered. She knew they were on the brink of something big, but she also knew the risks were growing by the minute. The next morning, as Amina and James prepared to meet the journalist, they received an unexpected call. It was from a former officer in Riverton who claimed to have information that could blow the case wide open. "I can't talk over the phone," the officer said. "Meet me tonight. I'll send the location." As the chaos unfolded around her, Amina felt a wave of relief mixed with lingering unease. Justice had been served, but the scars left behind wouldn't heal overnight. Riverton had a long road ahead, and she knew her fight wasn't over. In the days that followed, the story made national headlines. Amina's courage and determination was celebrated, and the investigation led to sweeping reforms in the town's law enforcement and local government. But even as the dust settled, she couldn't shake the feeling that there were still shadows lingering in Riverton, secrets waiting to be uncovered. And as she stood on her porch one quiet evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number, and the words sent a shiver down her spine. "This isn't over." Amina stared at the message on her phone for a long moment, her heart sinking despite the victory they'd achieved. "This isn't over." The words lingered like a ghost, reminding her that even when you uncover one truth, another can remain buried. She debated whether to tell James, but decided to keep it to herself for now. The last thing either of them needed was more tension after everything they'd been through. The days following the arrests were a whirlwind. Reporters camped outside Amina's house, eager for interviews, while Riverton buzzed with a mix of shock and relief. For years, people had whispered about corruption, but never imagined how deep it went. The evidence on the USB drive not only implicated Mitchell, but revealed a web of deceit spanning decades. Local officials, business owners, and even state representatives were named in the files. The fallout was monumental. James spent his time working with national outlets to ensure the story reached as many people as possible. He wanted the world to know Amina's role in exposing the truth, even as she shied away from the spotlight. "You're the reason this all came to light," he told her one evening as they sat on her porch, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows. "People need to see what courage looks like." But Amina wasn't sure she felt courageous. She was proud of what they'd accomplished, but the cost weighed heavily on her. Every time she walked through town, she felt the stares, some admiring, others resentful. Not everyone was happy about what had come out. Some blamed her for tarnishing Riverton's reputation, as if the corruption had been less damaging than its exposure. One afternoon, Amina decided to visit her grandmother's grave. The cemetery was quiet, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. She knelt by the headstone, tracing her fingers over the carved letters. "We did it, Grandma," she whispered. "We stood up for what's right, but it's so much harder than I thought it would be." As she sat there, a sense of peace washed over her. She thought about the generations before her, people who had fought for justice in their own ways, often without recognition. Amina realized that her fight was part of a much larger story, one that didn't begin or end with her. Meanwhile, Riverton began to change. The police department underwent a complete overhaul, with state and federal oversight ensuring accountability. Community leaders stepped up, organizing forums and town halls to rebuild trust. It wasn't easy, change never is, but for the first time in years, there was hope. James eventually decided to leave Riverton. The story had reignited his passion for investigative journalism, and he received offers to work on similar cases in other towns. On his last night in Riverton, he and Amina shared a quiet dinner. "You're going to do amazing things," he told her. "This town is lucky to have you." "And what about you?" Amina asked, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You're leaving me to deal with all this on my own." "You don't need me," James replied. "You've always been strong enough to handle this. I just helped you see it." After James left, Amina threw herself into community work. She partnered with local activists to create programs for at-risk youth, aiming to address the root causes of the issues that had plagued Riverton for so long. She also started speaking at schools and events, sharing her story in the hope of inspiring others to stand up for what they believed in. But even as the town slowly healed, Amina couldn't forget the message on her phone. She changed her number and took precautions, but a part of her always wondered if someone was still watching. She knew that exposing the truth didn't mean the fight was over. There would always be those who resisted change, who clung to power at any cost. One day, months after everything had unfolded, Amina received a letter in the mail. It was from Caleb's family, the young man whose disappearance James had uncovered in the files. They thanked her for bringing his story to light, saying it had given them the closure they'd waited years for. Amina sat on her porch with the letter in her hands, tears streaming down her face. For all the challenges she faced, moments like this made it worth it. She thought back to the day she had met James at the diner, how uncertain she felt about taking that first step. Now looking back, she couldn't imagine doing anything else. Life in Riverton gradually found a new rhythm. The town wasn't perfect, no place ever is, but it was moving in the right direction. Amina continued her work, knowing that change didn't happen overnight. She also knew that the fight for justice wasn't a one-time event, it was a lifelong commitment. As she walked through town one evening, she noticed people smiling and waving at her. Children played in the park, and local businesses bustled with activity. For the first time in a long time, Riverton felt alive. Amina stopped by the diner, her usual spot by the window waiting for her. She ordered her favorite coffee and watched the world outside, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over her. The fight hadn't been easy, and it never would be, but in that moment she knew it had been worth it. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in a warm golden glow, Amina allowed herself a rare moment of peace. She didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but she was ready to face them. Because if Riverton had taught her anything, it was this: even in the darkest moments, there's always light to be found, and always people worth fighting for.